Not only does Listen Layer allow you to more easily track conversions and other activity on your website, but it enables everyday marketers to implement very powerful data enhancements and segmentations that can really increase the insights you can gain from your web analytics. We're going to look at a simple example of this today within form tracking. And we're going to be using the HubSpot Forms listener to illustrate this. So I'll go ahead and turn that listener on. And it's important to note that I have my domain name properly configured in Listen Layer, and I have already deployed my Listen Layer script on all the pages of my website using Google Tag Manager. So once my listener is enabled, I need to turn on some features. And we're going to focus on the regular form activity features. Now, features that are listed under either of these activity filters will generate and push events and information into the data layer when that activity occurs on the website. And the listener automatically does this. So for example, when a regular HubSpot form loads on a page, this event called HS form loaded is pushed into the data layer. And when a form is submitted, this event HS form submitted is pushed into the data layer. And you'll notice that there's a bunch of additional information in our data layer example, and that's because the listener also grabs as much detail as it can from that form submission and makes it available as structured data. So we're going to turn on the form loaded and the form submission features. And we'll notice that on our event settings screen now, we have those two data layer events enabled. So we're going to go ahead and publish our changes. And then we are going to jump to Google Tag Manager. And we're going to go ahead and straight away just going to preview our demo website. Once that demo website is open, we are going to navigate to the HubSpot forms. But before I do that, I will open up the console. So on this page, you'll notice that in our console, we have 4 events called HS form loaded. And that's because there are 4 unique forms on this page. And if I look at my debug tool here in Google Tag Manager, those same 4 events are appearing over here on the left-hand side as messages in Google Tag Manager. And that's because Listen Layer automatically pushed them into the data layer. Google Tag Manager read that information and made the event available as a message. So now that this is here, we can grab onto this information, create variables, triggers, push that information into tags in our web analytics tracking. But today we're going to show you how we can actually categorize our different events using some rules inside of Listen Layer. And we're going to go through a pretty basic example of how this can be done. It can get extremely advanced. You can do some very powerful things with the rules inside of Listen Layer. But the first thing to note here is that we have 4 individual forms. We're just going to focus on categorizing these. And each of the forms might have some unique characteristics. In this case, we see that we have some form identifiers. These are just the standard form IDs that would be generated in HubSpot. In fact, if you're editing a form in HubSpot, this ID actually appears in the URL of the edit screen when you're changing the settings for that form. So if you wanted to find out which form this is inside of HubSpot specifically, you can literally grab this value, log into HubSpot, edit a form, change the ID to this in the URL, and you can easily find that. Now, there are a number of characteristics we could use in here to help to categorize our various forms. But I'm going to focus on the form ID for simplicity, as well as to illustrate the power of some of the rules that we can write. Now, Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about why we may want to actually categorize these forms. Let's say one of these forms is a demo form and another one is a newsletter form. Maybe another one still is just a content form, and then another one might just be, let's just call it a general contact form. Well, all of those form actions are not created equal. So in my marketing analytics and data, I really want to segment those out, at least segment out the ones that I care about from a marketing standpoint versus those that I might not. But to take that a step further, I might want to give the user a score, for example. Maybe a newsletter is a lower score than a piece of content, and a demo is more than a piece of content. But generally, I can do a lot of different things once I start to segment those out. Now, rather than sending a user to a thank you page and kind of decreasing the user experience on my site, this is all just going to happen as the user just interacts with the form and actually submits it. This information is going to be pushed into the data layer. So let's jump back into Listen Layer, and we're going to go to Features, and we're going to filter down to Customization and Storage. Now, you might be working with a different listener, and so this may look slightly different. However, almost all the listeners are going to be structured with filters in some fashion similar to this, where there's going to be one or more activity filters, there's going to be a customization and storage, and then there's going to be monitoring and reporting. And all of our listeners have this feature called Custom Data Layer Values. So I'm going to go ahead and enable this. And what this allows me to do is down here in this custom values section, which now appears, I can create rules. I can write simple rules, or I can write really advanced lookup rules that look for information in my data layer in real time and use that information to push additional information into the data layer. And I can push just simple text values that I define, or I can actually use other variables and values in the data layer to populate as a value into one of my custom variables. So before I dive into these rules, it's important to note that you actually create your variables at the global level. And that way you can utilize those across multiple different listeners. So here I've already created a few of those. We have form name, form category, conversion type, and a few others. Today, I'll probably just focus on these top two, form name and form category. So when a form loads on a page or a user interacts with it, maybe they submit it, and any action that Listen Layer can identify, I would like to also write some rules that push in the name of the form and how I would categorize that form. Is it a demo? Is it a contact us form? Is it a newsletter sign up? Maybe it's a content download. And so I'm going to actually write rules to push values into those variables. So now that I know I have a couple of these defined, I'm going to jump back to custom values. And we're going to go ahead and look straight at a lookup rule, which is a little bit more advanced than a simple rule. But the structure is generally the same at the outset. You're going to name your rule and maybe give it a description. You're going to write some conditions down here. And when those conditions are met, you're going to then set some values for some variables. So let's go ahead and we're going to call this form categorization. Now, bear in mind, I'm really focused on forms here, but because the variables are available at the global level, I could categorize conversions instead of categorizing forms. And I could do this across multiple actions. So I could write a rule where, a chat, sales chat or a support chat are actually kind of a conversion category similar to this. But just for the sake of simplicity, we're really going to focus on forms. Now, if you see these little eye bubbles, go ahead and read those. In this case, we want any events that we have happening for HubSpot forms, we want to apply these rules to. So I'm actually going to leave this empty. And it's just going to generally apply to any events that occur in the data layer from this HubSpot listener. And what I want to find is this field called Form ID. And the field is right here. And if I jump back to Google Tag Manager, again, this is the field that I'm going to care about right now. I want to look at this value, and based on this, I'm going to push in an actual category and a form name into the data layer. And those are actually going to appear down here in my custom values section. Now, in a second, after I finish creating this table, I'll show you how to find these variables over here in this variable settings screen. So bear with me if you have some questions on that. And we're going to go ahead and select form category and form name. And we're going to click save and manage. And actually, sorry, before I go much further forward, let me re-explain this. So these are the global variables from up here that I want to push values into that we talked about before. And so when my conditions are met, I want to define values for these two variables. And so when I click save and manage and I proceed forward, it's going to generate a table here. And I can add rows to this table. And what you'll see on the left here are my conditions. In this case, I only have a single field that I'm looking at, but I can have multiple fields over here, and they'll have an operator in between them, like an and, an or. And if these conditions are true in a given row, then I actually want to send some custom values into my data layer inside of these variables so that I can then grab on those in Google Tag Manager and use them in my conversion tracking rules. Or I could send the data directly into a tool like GA4. And it's important to note that these tables are read from top to bottom. And once a match is found on a row, it will stop. It'll return the values over here and it'll stop looking through the table. So the order that you put your information in can be pretty important. And I won't get into too many details about that. It would apply a little bit more if we had some additional conditions that we were caring about. So let's go ahead and just put a placeholder here because I want to navigate away, and I want to jump back to editing the rule setting, and I want to go into a little bit more detail about this right here. So these are variables that are automatically collected from the listener and pushed into the data layer when specific events occur. And as this happens on your website in real time, those variables start to appear on this screen. So if you're new to Listen Layer and you just turned this listener on and you haven't actually published it on your website, you haven't received any actual activity, meaning like this right here is activity, then you're actually going to see that this screen is empty. And you'll have to turn on the activity features. You have to let it run on your website, maybe jump over there and test some things, see the data layer happening, and then you'll get some information here. And what this is a reflection of all the variables that have ever been seen inside of your data layer. The automatic variables specifically. So here we are looking at form automatic variables and form ID. And so because on that previous screen, we were looking at just automatic variables overall, this form ID field should appear at the top level, which it does. It appears right here. But oftentimes you might be looking for something more specific like form location, like the origin path name is going to show the origin of the URL, you know, like kind of the top level domain, and then it's going to show the path name as well. And that you can see here is this value right here, form location dot origin path name. Now form location is inside of form automatic values. And so if we wanted to, we could actually use this and we could say, hey, if the form ID matches this and my origin path name has a certain value in it, then I want to categorize the form a certain way. And this can be very useful with a tool like Marketo. And actually, this is possible in HubSpot also, where you have like a global form. Maybe it does different things on different pages. And so what matters is both the form ID and the page that it's on in determining what the category of that form might be. So just for the sake of illustration, I'm going to put a friendly name in this because it'll make it a little bit easier for me to find. Now, these friendly names only apply inside the listen layer interface. It's not going to actually change the value of that variable. Sorry, inside of the data layer. So let's edit our rule set here. And we're going to add that form location right here. I'm going to save and next. And then we're going to save and manage. And now notice we have two fields that we're targeting as a condition. So now it's time to start building out our field, or our actual table here. So we're going to kind of go up this, and we're going to grab the form IDs. Now, this can seem a little bit laborious, but it can actually go pretty quickly if this is how you choose to write rules or you need to for your various use case. We actually have a feature here where you can export a template of this into kind of a CSV file. It's very simple. And then you can populate that and you can import it. And then once you have values imported, you can actually add new values by importing a new file. You can completely replace the table, or you can add a bunch of new values at the bottom or at the top. In this case, we only have a handful of values, so we're not going to worry too much about doing an export here. And right now, I'm only focused on the form ID itself. And hopefully I have no errors in copying these. Now we have a little regular expression cheat sheet here, which I like to use. I mostly use this wildcard value, which basically says, hey, if there's any value that exists here, let's match it. It's kind of a wildcard. So notice that any field here, we can say, hey, I want to use a regular expression. And here I'm going to use a regular expression also. And I'm actually going to add one more row, and this will all make sense here in a second. And I'm going to set another regular expression there. All of these URLs appear on this page. And my origin path name for that is this right here. So I'm going to grab that and I'm going to build this into my table. Now, again, if you're using these forms across tons of different pages and they do the same thing no matter what, then you probably don't need this variable at all. But in some cases, you might have a setup like this where this form does something specifically on this page, but then when that form exists on other pages, it does something else. And so what we have here is we have a more specific rule for this form ID above a less specific rule. And because the rules are matched from top to bottom, what'll happen is it'll read the table, row number 1, and then move to row number 2, and then 3, and then 4. And if it finds a match on number 4, it's not going to proceed to number 5. So that's why we want our more specific rule at the top, because let's say it doesn't find a match on this URL, but it does find a match on this form ID, then it's going to proceed to this one, and it's going to return the values from this row. So as basic and as simple as it seems, the order of the rules in the table can be extremely powerful. And I'll take this moment to just illustrate that this also applies at the overall rule level. And it looks like our dev team maybe just did a deployment. So sorry, I had a bit of a delay there. When you have multiple rules here at the custom rules level, you can actually drag and drop them. And again, it will read the rules from top to bottom. So for any given variable, it'll go down, it'll hit this table, it'll read all the rules inside of this. And if it finds a value, it'll stop. If it doesn't, it'll actually go to whatever your next rule is. And so you can create multiple rules and stack them on top of each other. And you can imagine how powerful this can be to really enhance your tracking overall across the board. So what we're going to do is we're just going to categorize these. Now, I'm going to do this randomly. because just an illustration. So this is the contact us, and this is, I'm going to say this is the footer contact us. And maybe you have like a main one on the page. I'm going to say this is a content download. I'm just going to call it content actually. And maybe this is an ebook, ebook 10 things. And then this guy is a demo form. And maybe on this page, this is a demo form for, maybe the US region. And then this over here might be a demo form for maybe EMEA. And down here, we have this catch-all rule. So what this is, hey, if you see a HubSpot form that doesn't have an ID that matches any of these and doesn't match any of these rules at all, we should probably still push some values into the data layer. So I like to have maybe a default value, maybe like content, so that our conversion tracking doesn't break. Or we can put unknown. And this is just kind of a side note here, but you can use a feature called the monitoring feature. And you can actually write a rule in the monitoring feature to target that custom data layer variable that we just defined the value as unknown for. And you can receive an email that says, hey, we just saw some HubSpot form activity that was not categorized correctly because we saw the value unknown in the form category variable. So this is another really powerful feature that if you're running analytics across multiple websites or a single website, and maybe you're not in full control of when forms are deployed, but you want to kind of keep track of what's going on, you can use this monitoring feature to receive real-time notifications about that and make those changes. So without getting into that too much further, we saved our lookup table and we're going to go ahead and publish this. So I'm just going to call this rules. And the publishing is pretty much immediate. Although I like to sometimes just do a bit of a hard refresh here. Now, the other thing to note is that depending on your Google Tag Manager debug, that will sometimes delay data layer activity. And hopefully they'll fix that in the future on a future release. But sometimes you'll see that you'll have delays in the actual data layer activity. So that's why it's important to note that you can turn off the Google Tag Manager debug, and you can actually just use the console, especially if you're seeing that there's some issues with the debug tool. So let's go ahead and we're going to refresh our preview here. Let's hope it connects fully. Looks like it did. So now what we're going to do is we're going to jump to HubSpot. We should see that same set of activity of HS form loaded. Now, if everything published correctly, we should start to see these custom values, form custom values, form category demo, form name US region. Down here we have one, form category content, ebook, 10 things. These are the values that we put into that table, footer contact us. And this one should be our demo or our newsletter form. I think the demo EMEA one was just kind of a made up rule about the form existing on a different page. But notice that because this rule is on top of this one, when this form ID was loaded, it caught at this row, matched, and it returned these values. If we were to change the order of these and then save and republish and everything, then actually that would return demo EMEA as the category. So this is really powerful. Now notice I'm using just my HubSpot form loaded event. If I actually submit one of these forms, I'm going to get the same data layer information, but it's going to be the actual form submission event that appears in the data layer. So you can see here, HS form submitted is the one that appears. But when I scroll down here, I should have this same custom values alongside this event. And remember, that's because I did not actually define the HubSpot event that I cared about. I just wanted it to apply to all events. And I use this regularly because, I almost always have form load turned on because it allows me to quickly identify what's on a page because the listener just automatically sees it, get characteristics about that, test rules, and I can do all of that without necessarily submitting a bunch of forms to make sure that they're working. And then, maybe on occasion I'll submit a test form in here to double check things. So now from this point, if you've made it this far, you're probably a relatively advanced user and you understand in Google Tag Manager that we can easily create variables now to capture that custom information that we just published into our data layer. And just to show you a little bit of a shortcut, if I want to grab this value like form category from my console, I can actually just copy the property path for this variable. And this will give me the path to that variable so that in Google Tag Manager, I can simply create a new variable. It's going to be from the data layer, and I'm just going to paste the path of that variable here. So this is my form category. And another way that you can do this is you can jump back into your variable settings. Oh, and actually, it's not available for custom variables, but if you're looking at grabbing an automatic variable, you can actually find the path here. We may eventually start to push the actual custom variables here just as validation that the variable has been seen with its various values. And so you may find that here in the near future. Now, once this is defined, once that variable is defined that I just created, I can do some pretty cool things. For example, just to give you kind of a quick preview, I can create a Google Ads conversion pixel. And this is going to come with a conversion ID, which is kind of like the pixel ID or the account ID. And the label is actually the conversion. So the conversion itself, I can go into Google Ads and I can create a conversion for demo forms, and I can create a conversion for all newsletter forms, and I can create a conversion for all content forms. And I can push those values into here by either storing them inside of Listen Layer directly or by using a lookup table inside of Google Tag Manager. So I can quickly just define, hey, and I'll do it real quickly here just to kind of show you this, but I can create a quick lookup table. And what I'm going to be looking up is that that form category. Did I save that? I mean, oh, here it is. Yep. And I'm going to say, hey, if this form category equals demo, then return, whatever the conversion label is that we got from our Google Ads. And if it's newsletter, then return the other conversion label, and so on and so forth. And then what I can do is I can just call this my Google Ads conversion label. Now, with a single Google Ads tag, I can track an independent conversion for all of those different form types. So I'm going to look for that lookup Google Ads conversion label. And then if I trigger this tag based on a form submission like this HS form submitted, then it's going to automatically grab the correct label and it's going to put it in here and it's going to send the conversion to Google Ads. Or it's going to trigger the conversion, which will send the data to Google Ads. And again, it's going to be getting that value for the lookup table in Google Tag Manager from this right here, demo. So let's go ahead and just illustrate this. We have an HS form submitted event. So this HS form submitted event I had created already. So I'll show you real fast. This is just on any HubSpot form submitted event, we have a trigger. So this is an easy way to track all your forms across the entire website. But once you get past that very basic, extremely powerful thing that Listen Layer can do for you, you can start to look at things like what we're doing now, which is where you start to actually segment your conversions. But your rules inside of Google Tag Manager are very basic. So every time a HubSpot form is submitted now, I'm going to trigger this conversion tag for Google Ads, and it's going to actually look up the label based on the value in this lookup table. So let's just refresh our preview and we'll just give it a go. Provided I actually typed the value correctly into that lookup table. So we're going to do a little experiment here, and we're just going to go ahead and submit this form. So we should get an additional HS form submitted event. And look, we have our Google Ads conversion tag is now firing on this, just like we configured. Now let's look at our data layer real fast, and we'll see if our custom value is still coming in. It is. And so what we can then do is we can verify this by clicking on the Google Ads tag and making sure that values is selected. Click show more. We can see the conversion label is 1234 34235. And again, if we go back here and we look up that lookup table here, that is the appropriate value. Now, if we submitted a new, whatever form was called a newsletter form, this same tag is going to fire, but the value inside of this is going to be different. So you can see how powerful it is that you can write these rules inside of Listen Layer and then manage it in such a way that your Google Tag Manager deployment is very simple, very scalable, and very dynamic. And then again, you can go back into Listen Layer and you can write things like monitoring rules to make sure that your configuration doesn't break, or to quickly identify if there are holes in that configuration. So glad you made it this far through the video. This is one of the most exciting features of Listen Layer, is the ability to push custom values in. What we went through today was like a pretty basic example of some of the very powerful things you can do. You can really take it to the next level. I'd love to see what you guys do with this and some of the cool things that you create. You can start your Listen Layer account for free, and it's free forever. You only pay for certain levels of volume, and if you want to enable certain premium listeners. So I would encourage you, for all your websites, jump in, create a free account, start simplifying your conversion tracking, and then start to enhance it with features like this.